Yeah, absolutely.
All right. So welcome everyone to our second in our series of Zoom calls we're doing through SBA. I hope everyone's doing well. I hope some of you were able to tune in for Dr. Cooper. I know we had a little bit of technical issues, but shortly we'll be posting them to our new SBA YouTube channel. So you'll be able to see the full video as well as some short clips that we'll also post to our socials. That'll be the same thing for this week's guest, who is Doug Glanville. Well, I'm sure some of you will definitely recognize as Professor Glanville, who taught sport and society last semester for UConn with us. He also played in the MLB for the Phillies, the Cubs, and the Rangers. Did I miss anyone?
Nope, that's it. Texas.
I'm sure you've seen him on ESPN. He does a ton of different stuff with ESPN. He's written for the New York Times, the Atlantic, ESPN, as well as the Undefeated. So I could spend the rest of the call just doing your resume, but I figured we should actually get into some questions. So with that, I'll start out the way we started out last week, Doug. I just wanted to ask you, in general, these last few weeks, this last month and a half, how is you, of a man of color and a father of children of color, been feeling? And has those feelings, the thoughts, have they been different than they have been this past 6 months, a year, 5 years, 10 years?
Yeah, I mean, it's roller coaster is probably the best way to describe it. I mean, because we're already coming through this pandemic and just the health crisis and trying to figure out, something basic like, all right, homeschooling or figuring out, where am I going to get groceries? All the fear around just survival has been so front in our minds. But then as in our course, we talked about the world without sports. And as athletes sort of engage in this space more to share about how to endure the pandemic, sort of workouts behind the scenes, we started to notice that a lot of the identity-based activism was shifting. And in fact, it was probably less covered, even though it was sort of there latent and sort of part of what was still continuing. And I think when we started to open up a little bit or get a little bit of sense of what we're facing with this health crisis, we started to see more of the inequities, the injustice start to come forward, whether, law enforcement and communities of color, all these things started to sort of collide. And I think my emotions followed that. It's like, okay, we're in this, we're trying to deal with this, but wait a minute, we're still facing this space here that we still have these divisions and this friction in our society that is now kind of even widening as we're dealing with the stress of something so great as our own health and safety. So there's no question that I started to dissect that. And of course, with George Floyd, that was really the watershed moment for me to, see how not only he was killed, but sort of the cavalier nature of it. And also all the elements I remember in working with the police council here in Connecticut, of all the things that led up to it, right? A large number of complaints against this officer and so on. You start to look a little bit beyond the sort of horrific visuals. And so coming through all that fog, there's still a sense of hope, still a sense of optimism that I've always retained when it comes to our country sort of being able to embrace all of our differences and ways to bring us together. And that is just seeing the conversation, seeing the engagement, seeing statements by the Boston Red Sox to acknowledge racism, acknowledge these pains in our society. I've definitely been encouraged by that. And now, as we will continue these discussions, it's more thinking ahead now about, okay, how are we transitioning to the action side of that? And when is really the right time? Because you want to make sure you get it right. You want to make sure you reconcile the history in a way that acknowledges, but also sort of even in the scientific or academic statistical sense, understand what are we quantifying too, whether it's, number of minority police officers. So all these elements have come together. And as a father, of course, I'm trying to keep my kids aware and understanding what's happening, but also not scared. And because, they're 12 and under, and trying to help them understand sort of the broader picture of it. So it's been, quite a bit, but at the same time, I still have spent a lot of time expressing ideas and writing and engaging on this subject.
And you mentioned kind of you've always had that hope and optimism around the conversations and what you're seeing. So I guess, has that hope and optimism ever wavered? Because it just seems to be getting, I mean, a lot of people have said that we've seen the same cycle over and over and over again. Like George Floyd is just sadly one name of many. That this isn't a 2020 problem. This has been a problem throughout the entire history of our country. So has there ever been a moment where you started to question that hope and optimism, or have you truly always kind of had that?
Yeah, and I've always been optimistic. And there's a couple other new factors in my life that may be different when I was growing up. One is I'm a father, and you think about the world you're trying to pass on, and you can't give up, cannot. That's one element. The other element is doing what I'm doing as a professor. I see the next generation, like yourself, Gage. I mean, the opportunity and the minds and the openness in the enrichment that I get, even being the professor, right? I feel like it's a very reciprocal relationship, and I have faith in these students and the next generation of leadership, because they are sensitive to this. They are horrified by what we saw with George Floyd. They are, and they will be leaders one day. And so, sure, there'll be, counter versions of people who may go against that grain and say, well, we're not meant to be together, whatever it may be. But I still see this general sort of arc of justice, as Martin Luther King talks about, in bending towards this humanity of that shared space. And it doesn't mean that I haven't had moments of frustration, or I got to get out of this, or I don't want to talk about this for this period. But I've always been fairly comfortable in this space, and part of it is I grew up in a town that voluntarily desegregated in the '60s, and we had access to each other. A very diverse swatch of people. It wasn't just lip service. We were truly inclusive. Baseball team, everything I played and involved in had diversity, had people at the table, and it transcended race, religion, gender, whatever. So that was one aspect. And when I went to my 30th reunion, people felt like they just left from 1988. I mean, the access was incredible.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one aspect of it that made me see it that way. And then baseball, my volunteer coaches were law enforcement, were police officers, or at least one primary was a detective. And that gave me access as a teenager to seeing their lives and understanding their stresses that they're under, and really being able to see how we can still be a team. And there's a privilege to that access, but I recognize that it's still an example of what is possible.
Absolutely. So you mentioned a couple different articles that you've written, and we'll definitely touch on some of those. So the first one I want to touch on, again, you've already mentioned, is the one you wrote about when you were racially profiled in your driveway here in Connecticut. So for those of you that, I know you told the story in class as well, but for those that haven't heard that story, could you just briefly recap it? And then more importantly, what I want to get into with it is when that situation's happening, at least do you remember in that moment kind of what's going through your head? What are you feeling emotion? And like, did that change over the next day, month, year, or did it kind of that same emotion that you felt then still kind of linger in you?
Yeah, I mean, it was a transformational moment. I mean, and it's not that I hadn't had moments that had these racial overtones or undertones, but it's the way it coalesced around being at home, right?
Mhm.
So this is 2014, and it's February, snowing, for 4 days in a row, absolutely freezing, 0 degrees. And, so I go outside middle of the day and I'm shoveling my driveway, and I'm trying to get this minivan out, because I'm like, all right, I can't have my kids stuck at home for another day. So I got to get this out. So I'm shoveling, and I get to the end of my driveway, and I look up, and there's a West Hartford police cruiser across the street. It was a SUV, and I'm pretty good with cars and what brand they are and all that. And I thought it was strange because, all the Connecticut people out there, Connecticut is very provincial, just like I grew up in Jersey. So every town has its own everything, right? Own police force, own. So when you see another town police, you're kind of like, oh, that's kind of strange. So, but I was just waiting and kept shoveling. And then after a few minutes, he gets out of his car, and he has this kind of, just his face is shown. And young guy, no facial hair, probably in his late 20s, which he turned out to be. He crosses the street. And now I'm kind of like, okay, what's going on here? So I kind of stand up, and he comes across, and I remember my dog's coming out and at the fence just barking. Rrr, rrr, rrr. So, no introduction, no anything, just straight at me says, so you're trying to make some extra bucks shoveling people's driveway around here? So I was like, okay, this is a bad start.
Mm-hmm.
And I had, no idea what was going on. I didn't know if he was chasing a felon or so, but I had no insight. And I realized my reaction is going to dictate a lot of what happens next. And hopefully he sees whatever I do as a de-escalation and that he could follow suit. And, so I kind of small talk about, no, this is my property. I kind of,
Mm-hmm.
and this small talk eventually evaporated into his leaving, where he said, happy shoveling. But there was no acknowledgement, apology. It was just like, that was it. He's on to his next thing. The backstory is they were looking for a guy they thought was called on who apparently existed weeks prior, and he had a shoveling dispute. I know it sounds wild, right? So he had a dispute over pay over shoveling someone's driveway or walkway in West Hartford. And I lived in Hartford right at the border.
Mm-hmm.
And, they said, well, if this guy comes back or something, call us. So the neighbor, not even the person this had the dispute, the next door neighbor calls the police on someone who she thinks looks like him. So it's all attenuated. And I guess after they finally responded, they dispatched, they went across the town lines. And come to find out, there's only two ways you can cross town lines in official business, policing wise, in the state of Connecticut. And this already existed. It's a felony in progress, or you're in hot pursuit of someone that you have the authority to arrest.
Mm-hmm.
So neither of those burdens were met. Can you investigate? Can you do certain things? Certainly, but then you'd wonder why the line of questioning went the way they did with me. And so from this experience, here are the kind of key takeaways. One is I spent the next 2 months engaging, and it was purposeful. I really didn't know what to do at first because it was so it took the wind out of me for a couple of days.
Mm-hmm.
But then when I kind of collected, I ended up meeting West Hartford and the police and the deputy and everybody, not the officer involved, but started talking, wrote letters, had engaged conversation. Then I just went on a whole tour to make sure that it wasn't really about my own edification. I wanted to understand more about what is at play here. What are the laws? Maybe he has a right to be here. I didn't know. So I wanted to find out more. So I met with police. I met with attorney generals. I met with lawyers. I met with officials, community leaders, state reps. I went and I just got this data and I collected it. And then I wrote an article now informed about all these points of view. And the article dropped in February, about 2 months later, or no, it's April, 2 months after the February incident.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of sped from there. So I think, we talked in our class about grassroots movements, and this became what was community development. This is where you bring as many people to the table as possible. They're invested in the outcome. And although it's tension, there's frustration, there's maybe anger, we kind of find a space to move forward, but we work within the system. And that became a bill that was floated out to becoming a law. And it wasn't about racial profiling. It wasn't about racially inspired engagement. It was about jurisdiction and your right to be there. And what that allowed us to do is find the best legal argument and then allow the social implications wash over through the engagement over the article and in the discussions. And that's exactly how it played out. And so, you could point fingers and say, oh, this police department's great. I just thought that was not constructive, because once you start naming names and going on a media tour, blasting West Hartford police, you lose advocates, you lose that common ground that you can actually realize that a lot of people supported me, even in law enforcement. They thought it was offensive. And so it led to this sort of unified solution. And it didn't happen overnight, but it slowly marched towards hearing my story saying, look, I was just shoveling my driveway, dude. Is this, where does this happen? And so people started to see that. And so I was encouraged with the outcome, and it became a law in about 18 months after it happened. And it was supported bipartisan people, law enforcement. Because when people came to testify, they expressed so many different things that were wrong with it. Mm-hmm. And so I think it was, it's part of what you asked earlier. This is what gives me some optimism, because the system really worked. It was engaging. It was patient, and it was the long game, and the long game tends to sustain longer. in the outcomes. And they have a whole new chief of police now in West Hartford. They've done a lot of work, and actually work with them on the police council. So so that was sort of the experience, but also the outcome.
So you kind of talked about how you went about it in a very pragmatic way. Like you really examined the situation. Like you said, you didn't want to make it about pointing fingers. You didn't want to make it about calling names. You actually kind of really went about it in a very organized and actually brought about real change. So I guess what I wanted to pull out is, again, I think there's a lot of people, especially like me, that, from the white community, that we would never have that type of interaction. Like, it just wouldn't happen in that way. And me not really understanding it, my instinct would be, I would have gotten angry. Like, why are you here? Why are these questions to me? Like, I'm just going about my thing. So I guess my question is, like, did that anger happen and you were able to quickly suppress it? Or, like, did you really not get angry, and why didn't that anger come up? Because I feel like that would just be a lot of people's natural reaction to the situation, which obviously I don't think the same outcome would have happened as opposed to the way you approached it.
Yeah, I mean, excellent point, Gage. I mean, and I'll give you some examples. A lot of people who genuinely were offended and cared about me and knew me at ESPN or wherever, I would hear a lot, well, you know what I would have done? It was something like that. Like, you know what I would have done? I would have told this guy. And you don't realize sometimes that I knew I didn't have that luxury. And so part of it is walking through the Black experience my entire life and knowing that, okay, I got to really think this through. And yeah, I may be angry. And of course I was angry. I was in my own driveway, and this guy took something from me that it's not my life. It's not, quantifiable, but it's like the peace and dignity of, like, I'm in my house. I'm just like, I haven't shaved in 5 days, whatever. And I'm just shoveling my driveway, doing something for my house, right?
Yep.
And so just to feel threatened and have an engagement like that in your own space is really disconcerting. And so I knew when he was crossing the street that I needed to disarm. That's all I kept thinking, disarm, non-threatening stance. And yeah, there's a privilege in knowing either how to do that, or because look, I can say it in a racial connotation, as you mentioned, being white or Black, but it's also, there are people who are Black get pissed off and angry, understandably.
Mm-hmm.
And, I say, well, what, if I pick my shovel up or did something, how does that go? And what was so fascinating about the interaction around that, so after the article dropped, a local voice who I have great respect for, wrote an article totally, I won't say trashing me, but very much the counter narrative.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of it sort of ended in this sort of, well, he kind of wasn't tasered. There's worse things that's happened. And I think what started to enter the conversation after that was, you need to, whether we call it microaggressions, you need to see the connection between why something innocuous can be fatal. And it seems like a ridiculous leap, right? But then you start going, well, Trayvon Martin was walking down the street with Skittles, and Eric Garner was selling cigarettes, and Michael Brown, whatever, might have been jaywalking. Or you start going, wait a minute, these guys ended up dead. They ended up dead. Mm-hmm. And even if they resisted arrest, or, let's just throw that out there. Is it a death sentence? I mean, you have to start asking those questions. And why is it a death sentence in certain people or certain circumstances? And so it didn't take long for some innocuous things to end up fatal or go really badly. And my situation's clear. If I'm like, you need to get off my property right now before I take this shovel, like, where does that go? Because as soon as I do that, I become wrong, because it's a different case now. It's not about investigating or shoveling guy. It's about, or being a suspect even, it's a threat. And then he has certain rights. And that goes, so yeah, can you do all this calculus? So I'll give you another example. If my son is 17, 16, and he's out there that same day, and I'm inside chilling on the couch, and the officer pulls up, then what happens? Now he's a teenager, he's mad, like, who do you know my dad, whatever, like, where does that go? So it doesn't take long when you have enough experiences to be able to compartmentalize that I only have a couple of options here. And you have to think like that. And unfortunately, look, it doesn't reflect the real outrage in your outward emotion, but you want to live to fight another day. And so, this guy definitely took something that day, but I spent a lot of time trying to recapture it personally, but also for something bigger than self. And so that was where my strength was lying, that I had the patience and the sort of forecast to say, wait a minute, okay, this isn't a battle I'm going to win right here,
Mhm.
but I play the long game. And I'm very fortunate because I didn't do this by any stretch alone. I had a lot of help and a diversity of help, right? It wasn't just people who looked like me. It was tons of people had my back, and that made a huge difference.
Absolutely. And like you said, I think the way you went about it, while it may have been tougher and initially, was the whole reason that I think you were able to actually create real change and having that bill passed and everything, which is sadly probably the exception, greatly the exception to the rule, as opposed to what normally happens in that situation. So another article it was an essay you wrote for ESPN called "Enough" that was really powerful. They had a video accompanying that you kind of did a voiceover with it as well that kind of summarized what you said in it. I'd encourage everyone to look that up. But in part of that essay, you talked about how initially a lot of these athletes, when they tried to speak out, when they tried to use their platforms, they were told by a lot of people, I get it, or this is great, but not here, not now. I don't want this with my sports. Colin Kaepernick, I can't listen to you when you're disrespecting the flag by kneeling. LeBron James, shut up and dribble. I don't want to hear you talk about politics. You're a basketball player. So, and when I hear that, I think that's in the narrative a lot. And what I try to think optimistically is a lot of people saying that maybe come from not necessarily a place of hate, but a place of ignorance, and don't really understand what that means to the person that you're telling that to. So I guess as both a black man and a former athlete, what goes through your head, or how do you feel when someone tells you, or if someone told you, hey, Doug, I think what you're saying is great, but you can't talk about that in sports. You're a baseball player. I just want you to go out there and play baseball. That's what I'm here for.
Yeah, and there's a couple of layers to that, and I understand where the sentiment comes from in certain circumstances. Like, okay, I'll try to use an analogy. I go to a concert, and 30-minute intermission. There's a campaign for the rainforest, and and it may be a cause that I care about, but so I understand when people try to bifurcate entertainment. So so it doesn't, like you said, it doesn't always have to come from a place of hate. But where I talk about in the most recent article I wrote for The Undefeated about the comma effect is this idea that, I can't bifurcate my life like that. I don't have that. And maybe it's a luxury. I don't know. I can't just be like, oh, I'm just going to play, because I'm in a permanent uniform as a black man. It doesn't matter whether I'm, because eventually, even if I'm in uniform, what could possibly happen, AKA Adam Jones, Torrey Hunter, whatever.
Mhm.
Or I go back home, I come back from ESPN and an officer's in my driveway. Like, I don't know. So I don't, I don't know how to separate that in a real organic and authentic way, because it is part of who I am as an athlete. And so that's one thing that I kind of respond to. But also I look at history. Athletes have always been part of this conversation, always, and especially when you talk about the black community, because there's a time where black community didn't have the cachet or the access to enter it many other ways. There was not the diversity of professions available to African Americans. There wasn't, so some of these Jackie Robinson that had the voice, they had to use it for certain purposes. Now, Jackie Robinson integrated the first major American institution ever before the military. So you can imagine, what is he going to do? Shut up and dribble? Like, I mean, he knew what was on his shoulders.
Mhm.
And by the way, I think the main thing is sports is better than that. I mean, sports has so much to offer, and I make the argument that it's uniquely qualified, more so than many professions, to speak on these issues. One,
Mhm.
you have a team of people that come from in different planets, whole different worlds, right? I played with guys from all over the place. And you come together for a common goal. Olympians, for example, you come together. and you learn how to work with different people. And so you know to a certain core how you set certain things aside, how you work together. You understand that how important it is to then realize, like, wait a minute, this is a person I thought X about, but now that I've seen them in their work ethic and I have a different perception. Athletes have that experience all the time, especially at the professional ranks, all the time. They are very qualified. Number two, sports is obsessed with equity, obsessed,
Mm-hmm.
because you don't have a sport without rules that are fair and equal and have some egalitarian, equitable way that they're enforced. Could you imagine, like, okay, I like the Brooklyn Nets and they're playing against the Lakers. Oh, the Lakers are going to now shoot on a hoop the size of a Prius. But, oh, the Nets are going to shoot on a hoop the size of a postage stamp. You would be outraged no matter what. Like, and the sport would be outraged because people would say that is an inauthentic game. I mean, that's what so those are two examples of how sports are uniquely situated to actually be an example for our larger society as to what is fair and what we're trying to achieve aspirationally as a nation. So there's many reasons I reject stick to sports. Some are personal, some are larger, but I don't want to conflate this idea that, okay, you're distracting me because I want to chill with my beer and I want to watch the football game, versus the larger undertones of what is said about protest and all these other things, that are not, I don't think, align the same way. And so, Colin Kaepernick, for example, is getting more and more on the right side of history, so to speak, right? Because we're seeing that, oh, wait a minute, this is a nonviolent procedure, a nonviolent protest. It's a lot better than breaking windows, right? Nonviolent. And, that sentiment was expressed in a way that's within our rights as American citizens. And it was kind of dismissed on a large percentage of the population. And in fact, it was demonized at a certain point. He still hasn't played football. So there's that. And so when is the right time? When is the right place? I've heard that all my life. Oh, it's not the right time. He didn't say it quite this way. As if that if it was said perfectly, something would change. It feels disingenuous when people summarize it in the timing and all these other things. Martin Luther King said, and I wrote it in that essay, it's not, when is the right time? We always know that people tell us to wait, and wait always seems to mean never.
Mm-hmm.
So when is the right time? I don't know. But I know when you are feeling and go through these experiences, like someone in my driveway or a cab driver telling me to go take the bus in LA, or trying to test drive a car and the guy saying you lost the keys, or, I mean, I can go on and on. You don't feel like waiting, quite frankly. You don't. And you want to be able to take responsible action.
And you mentioned it too, but I think it's also kind of hypocritical. A lot of people want genuineness out of athletes. They want as much access to them. They want to know about people. That's why they follow them on social media. They like to see them outside of sports. I think that's becoming more and more popular in pop culture. They're kind of becoming bigger than sport. You certainly see that with the superstars like LeBron James. But at the same time, then all of a sudden they talk about a social or political issue they don't agree with. And now all of a sudden they want to walk that back and say, I want you to be genuine, but not genuine in a way that I don't agree with.
Yeah, Gage. I mean, right. Well, think about like what I do, right? We're media, sports media, 24-hour news cycle. I mean, 24 hours, like go, 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 go. So you want all this information. LeBron James stubbed his toe. He had a pinky infection, but then when he's like, oh, wait, I have the microphone. You want to know who I dated in third grade. So, of course and by the way, when you're constantly presented with this platform, eventually you're sort of like, I need to do something with this. It's like my cousin just got shot or pulled over or whatever. You just want to start to use that because it's certainly used to open up your life in many other ways. And you feel like to see the whole picture of who I am, this is part of who I am. And so that is you want a role model, as you said, but then don't speak on the biggest inequities of our country. I just don't, it doesn't make sense. And I think more and more people are embracing this as, it doesn't make sense. And I think they're starting to more and more see the importance of it. And I'm curious how sports will respond, because it's not just about going back and playing. What are the platforms that are going to come with that? Or is baseball going to let, people wear logo? I don't know. I'm kind of curious.
Yeah. Like I said, I hope more and more people start to come around to that idea of kind of letting athletes be genuine and more holistic kind of in when they're addressing the media. So you've already mentioned it already, but I have a couple questions on it. The article you wrote for The Undefeated, like you said, it's your most recent article, The Comma Effect. It's a really great article. We'll post it on our socials. I encourage everyone to go and read it. Some of it you actually talked about in class. I know we talked about the comma effect when we we're kind of talking about media and the way it can form things. So the first thing I want to ask is, for everyone that doesn't know, can you just briefly explain what the comma effect is?
Yeah, well, it came up in the class. We talked about wordplay and headlines. That was sort of one of our weeks. And it's the idea, USA Today did sort of a dive into how you have these headlines and you have sort of the protagonist, right? Britney Spears is walking down the street, comma, and then there's something that comes with it. And there's a judgment somewhere in there that leads the reader. It may be subtle, but it leads the reader a certain direction. And the comma effect talks about the bias behind that vis-a-vis race in America. This idea that, okay, Trayvon Martin was walking in this neighborhood and got, vigilante shot, whatever. Oh, comma, he sold weed when he was 13 or something, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or, a guy who shoots up a movie theater, it's horrible, comma, but he was, the altar boy in church. And, so that there's a little bit of be sympathetic of this person, or, yeah, this guy deserved it, right? And I started to look at it through race and see that often with race, the person who's black gets that comma, he deserved it, negative, even George Floyd, right? Checkered record, whatever. But to make the jump to say this guy deserved to die under these circumstances is a whole different thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so it leads the reader, it leads the mind to say, this is deserved or this is unjust, right? And so I looked at it through my career, and I wanted to walk through something special to us in sports and baseball, and show these different moments where I had these commas. And I think woven through it is this feeling that I was trying to express of my desire to be accepted on some level, right? So my desire to find this fair space. And so I was like, oh, wait a minute. Oh, I got this Ivy League engineering degree. Oh, that will solve it, right? Or whatever. I tried to express that these hopes when I was 20, thinking that some things would change because I was told that you do these things, you live a right way, you make these decisions, that things will be fair, and we all go through that expectation. But I eventually wanted to bring it back to, what we've heard a lot with the people we've seen, especially law enforcement and people of color, and these outcomes when people are killed. What is said later, like, oh, well, this is your hero now. This guy had, felony arrest, but to make this step to say deserve to die, that is a very different conclusion. And we have to check the media, and I'm in the media,
Mm-hmm.
and check ourselves and where our bias can take us, because sometimes it's led that way.
Absolutely. So before I follow up, I just want to say I'll ask this next question, and then we can actually start to take some questions for everyone that's here. I know I see Frank, Danielle, Amabla. You guys joined a little bit after I started. So I'll keep you muted for now. If you don't actually want to talk, you can just type your question in the chat and I can ask Doug. Or if you actually want to ask Doug yourself, just type in the chat, hey, I have a question for Doug, and I'll unmute you and you can go ahead and do that. So while you guys think of that and set that up, I just following up on the comma effect. Part of that article, I actually pulled a quote from it because I want to ask you about this quote. Is it weird when people quote your own writing right back to you? I feel like it might be a little awkward to have your own words right back at you.
No, that's, I definitely hear that a decent amount. Now, it's weird if you quote yourself, so I think that would be weird, but
Mm-hmm. All right. So you said in that article, when you were talking about being drafted by the Cubs in the first round, you said, as a black man in America, despite the ennobling narrative that is often told, Major League Baseball wasn't saving me. And that really stuck out to me, as I think that's a super popular and almost like proud belief that we have in sports, is like, hey, look at us. Sports is so great because no matter what circumstances you come from, whether it's bad, you can get really good at sports, and now you can be famous and rich and you can have everything you ever wanted. And that's kind of the epitome. So I wanted to ask you, I think you touched on a little bit, but I kind of want to ask you directly, why wasn't kind of achieving what the epitome of what your childhood dream was, being a first round draft pick in the MLB. Why wasn't that like the peak of your social status? Why did you need more commas after your name in order to kind of feel validated in a a real part of whatever's the society and the social structure in our country?
Yeah, excellent question, Gage. I would say, I think my sentiment about that particular quote was about this idea of being, saved or rescued, because so often the narrative, and of course there's real examples too, that you came from poverty, you had, you saw the draft, right? Was it the NFL draft? They have these interesting little tidbits about players, and this idea that the sport is rescuing me from this Black experience or this disadvantage, poverty, whatever it may be. And I think sometimes that comes with that is either there's a debt owed, or it's, don't speak on these issues now or whatever, or there's sort of this pat on the back, right? Oh, I'm rescuing somebody. And of course, there's inspiring stories when people come from extreme circumstances and achieve these goals. But the story isn't written then. The story is still being written in their life beyond. And whether it's Kaepernick or whoever it may still be trying to address certain things that even in their, 8-figure salaries, they still feel this second-class citizenship. And so that's why I felt that, saving me, I was fortunate. Both my parents went to college, first generation. My dad was an immigrant from Trinidad. I came along and they gave me an opportunity to get an Ivy League education. And, I had great opportunities and I could have done a million things. Scott Boras was recruiting me in college. And at one point he came to my dorm and was telling me how much money I'd be giving up by signing for, a certain signing bonus as a first round draft pick and playing in the minor leagues, making like $327 every 2 weeks, when I could be an engineer and making, $100,000 a year. So he was kind of making that point of like, they're not saving you, right? You could do this other thing, at least economically. But the dream was part of my dream and my choice too. And I think the connect those dots was an important goal of mine. And so you ask about these commas. Well, part of it was the tone set my family of achieving. And I wasn't so much, I want the comma as much as I want to achieve certain things. I said, okay, I set out to get a degree, and it didn't have to be an Ivy League degree, whatever, but I wanted to graduate. These were important parts, not only to me, but to my family and the legacy of my family. So I had a certain drive along those lines. But I also knew that the comma in and of itself wasn't the answer. I didn't want it to be this superficial, like the alphabet soup after me. I needed to know that it actually had a substance behind why the commas were there, and really to be defined without it. And I think in the article, I try to kind of think back to this, like, I won't give away the close, but the idea of how it ends is like taking ownership of, I can be what I want to be. And I know there's a privilege to that. That's what I recognize, because I've been afforded certain opportunities that my parents laid out. But I've taken it as far as I could take it, and I try to continue to be appreciative of that and what I do forward. And so I don't have this complacency wash over me, because I feel like there's so much to do, and at the center of it is creating understanding, and that work is never done. It's never supposed to be done.
Mm-hmm. I just find it really interesting. You had that realization before you even got drafted. Because I try to think back, like, to my kind of athletic career. Obviously I wasn't on the level of yours, but kind of going back to high school, like with football, that was kind of all that was in my mind. Like, I didn't think about being multifaceted. I didn't think about having different kind of accomplishments and, different substance, like you said, to those things. I just thought about, I am a football player. That is who I am. Therefore, my penultimate achievement is just being a better football player. And I think it's a trap a lot of athletes fall into. And we talked about it a little bit over the course of the semester, but I think that's just why then it becomes difficult for them to retire, is because now all of a sudden, this was all I wanted to be. This is who entirely as I was. Now it's not who I am. So I think it's really interesting that you were able to have that realization before your career even began instead of having to deal with that once it was over.
Yeah, and to your point, the other thing that comes up, you take PEDs, or like when you don't feel like there's any other road, you will take the extreme measure to hold on to the status, the comma that defines you. And there is a trap in that. I've like I said, credit good fortune to be able to see that, and my parents, and just saying, look, when you could have the greatest career under the sun. I played with Alex Rodriguez, and he was pushed out of the game at 40. I was done at 35. Like you have a whole life ahead of you, God willing. So I just never, even if you reach the pinnacle of your career, there's a second act. And I knew that it was important to be able to try to own that in a way that didn't always lean on the ball player, right? And I loved, I loved playing. I had a great time in the big leagues, and it was everything it was cracked up to be in many regards. But I also knew that I was getting older. Those hamstrings start barking, shoulders messed up, whatever, it doesn't, you start to watch what's happening. It's like, I better be ready for this. And it wasn't enough for me to, sit on some Brinks truck or something and just be home. I just felt, especially with my parents, I had so much more that I wanted to do and engage on.
Absolutely. I just want to pause again. Frank, Amable, Jason, if you have anything, just go ahead and drop it in the chat, and I'll ask Doug, or feel free to ask him yourself.
Yeah.
I know we're getting a little closer to the end here, so I want to make sure I give you guys a chance to ask anything if you need. Yeah, let me go ahead and unmute you, Jason.
All right.
Hello.
Yeah. Hey, Jason.
Hi, I'm Jason Moreno. I'm a rising sophomore in the pre-sports management program. And I actually have a question to ask because you mentioned the comma effect, and I realized now just listening that media does make their headlines in certain ways to display certain things. And one thing that came to mind was, I'm from Staten Island, where Eric Gardner was killed. I actually live like 5 minutes away from where he was killed. So when I think about that, I remember how some people tried like justifying his death by mentioning his past criminal record with the numerous counts of like assault and whatever else he did. But people who have committed mass shootings like Nicholas Cruz back in Parkland, Florida, and they listed him as a mentally ill kid who made mistakes and didn't get the proper help he needed. So my question really is, like, how do we go about fixing labels to men such as Eric Gardner, who died in police custody, to have them their death be justified in that such way?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a great question, and part of it is, I don't want to blanket like the media, but the media has a responsibility, and I do see encouraging signs. Just take the New York Times, for example, who's gone back now and reprinted many obituaries that were omitted because they were people of color or people that were not deemed as significant. And then you all of a sudden now see Henrietta Lacks and many of these figures to get these, who would have been national news, certainly in the modern sensibility. So part of it is there is an opportunity to kind of create some sort of redress, or, okay, like the 1619 project, where you can kind of say, okay, wait a minute, now we want to recognize that we are part of this. And if we continue to say, well, this guy deserves to die with a comma and justify in hindsight sometimes, then you end up sort of part of the problem. And bias is not immune to media. The idea when you have objectivity is to have multiple sources, but then there's a business side to media. If you're the New York Times or whatever, that you need to draw readers in. You need to get content that's attractive. You need to have headlines. You need to have clicks. And there lies the sort of tension about, creating something that's fair and equitable. And so that pressure needs to also be part of it. It's not just law enforcement. It's not just, we need to continue to look at all of our institutions, all of our expectations, to see where bias plays a role. And it has been racialized, there's no doubt, throughout our history. And actually one of the USA articles we use in class is about gender. It's about women that get, paparazzi, and they're saying, whatever, Britney Spears, I keep using Britney Spears, but, Megan Fox is walking down the street, look at her hair, comma, look at her hair, and you start to think, well, oh yeah, why are they so focused on that? She's just walking her dog, so it could be in some more subtle ways or not as, fatal around policing, and it still has the same toxic effect. And so, holding the press accountable is completely reasonable.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Jason. Great question, man. So I don't think anyone else, either Frank or Mable, has a question. I know we're coming up on 7, Doug, which I promised you would be the cutoff. Oh, you got 1 sec, Mable.
Wait, yeah. How you guys doing? How you doing, Doug?
Good. How you doing, Mama?
Good. The question I had, I wrote in the chat, but I guess you guys didn't get it. So what do you think Major League Baseball can do regarding the Black Lives Matter movement, and do you believe that they will even do anything at all to be able to use their platform that they have?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question on unknown. I know NBA, there's a different, well, not only different demographic, a different prioritization on how they address social issues. And baseball is really thinking hard about how to approach this. You've seen Theo Epstein with the Cubs and their GM trying to figure out, okay, wait a minute now, we have to really look at this in a deeper dive. And so he did on draft, I believe it was draft day, had all the GMs have Black Lives Matter signs. And so I think there's an appetite to figure out how to support the movement. I just don't know, are they going to be on everybody's spikes or whether they're going to be something more subtle. So, but baseball is making an effort, and given their demographics are different, but they're also in the end very diverse. You have players from Latin America and Asia, and so they have a very unique diversity that is powerful. I think could be celebrated more. On Wednesday this week, I have an article for ESPN.com about 5 things Major League Baseball can do right now to respond to their stances on social injustice and racial injustice. So, I think there's definitely low-hanging fruit, so to speak, in a sense of, here's an apple, we can grab this and do something really powerful with it, and they have certainly the platform to do that. So, but yeah, people are watching, and especially with the pandemic, baseball starting, there's a lot of attention paid, and there's no doubt that baseball has been highly criticized for a lot of the slowness in their response for some of these issues, and also their support of holding on to kind of old stodgy ways about cultural norms within the sport. So they're going to be and I think they have an important role, because the NBA, it's a little easier for communities to dismiss it. Well, they're 85% black or whatever. So, but this is a diverse group of people that can come together very quickly around it. So it's a great question, and I'm excited to find out what, and maybe I need to ask and find out, but I know they're sweating it though. So they're a little nervous.
Yeah, thank you. And if I could just ask one more question, Gage, is that okay?
Yeah, go ahead, Mable. And then Jason, I'll kick it to you right after Mable is done with his second question. I see you got another one.
Yeah, I got time, so it's good.
Okay. My second question is just regarding just the season. How do you think that will go? I mean, I saw you recently, like the other day on ESPN, talking about how you weren't sure how well it was gonna go, and how like the protocols that they've been setting up were gonna be basically just fit into like the game and everything like that. But just for like better feel for it, like what do you think is gonna happen regarding the season, and do you even think is going to be able to go all the way through the 60 games?
I mean, I think it's going to be very difficult to go all 60 games, all these teams, without some interruption by one of the teams or something. It's so much uncertainty, and you already see some of the wheels coming off early on. The Nationals canceled, Astros, teams are just like not practicing. They're not getting the test results back, which creates another whole equity question about even getting the test that quickly, right? So they're struggling out of the gate here, and there's players like Mike Trout with big question marks about, do we have control over this? The Korean Baseball League has done fairly well. They've had no setbacks. Their season has gone on, I think, 60 games now. So, but they had a very different approach early on. They were highly aggressive. They tested super aggressively early on, and they have contract tracing. I mean, they were like that from jump, and they're still approaching it like it could fall apart at any time. So that seems to be what it takes. And I don't know if we're there. We have different states with different approaches, people coming from all over the place. Some are positive already. And so I guess in short, I was expressing on ESPN the concern that they may not get out of spring training, or certainly not all the teams. And that creates its own problem. I'm hopeful they do. I hope they do. But the testing's not gone super well already. That is the key to how they're able to figure out how to move forward and how to do this safely. And so until they get those protocols ironed out, I think you're going to see some more delays and players, you're stressed out. You're not sure what's going on. So yeah, that's where it is. So I'd be shocked if every team plays 60 games uninterrupted. I'd be surprised. I hope it happens, but it just seems very difficult to pull off.
Thank you, Doug.
All right, let me kick it to you, Jason. I know you have another question as well.
All right, yeah. My question is, yesterday during a press conference, Son Doolittle had spoke, and he has said that sports is the result of a functioning society. So when you hear that, like, what do you make of it, and like, how much to the extent do you agree with that?
Yeah, Sean is incredible. I've had him in my class at Penn, so I'll try to bring him back this year. He's been on my podcast recently talking about this, and his wife will be on tomorrow. So we're excited. I think he's saying that sport, you think about the derivatives of sport, right? So it's kind of a war game, right? It started off and maybe there was gladiators and there actually was death, but the ability to organize it in a way to treat it as sport with stakes that include respect for your opponent and to sort of evolve to the stage of civil disagreement is a sign of a society embracing this idea that we can disagree, we can battle, we can have loyalties, but they're not so blind that we forget humanity and that we don't have to do this to the death. We can do it in a way that celebrates tactics and strategies and even tensions and frictions and still come out in a way that the sport is still elevated as most important because it's society as an analogy, and still come out with a great respect for the rules, that we need them intact. So I 100% support that sentiment that it works well in its best reflection of what we're aspiring to be in the way we agree or disagree, and the way we engage constructively. And that fight for those rules and playing for something bigger than self and elevating something that's larger than a team, like a league or a sport, that's powerful. And I don't think that's all the more reason I don't take it lightly as sport being part of the solution, and not so much as an end game. I think as the perpetual advocate and sort of ally to working on how we get along well as a larger society. So I support that 100%.
All right, yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Jason. So we have about time for maybe one more question. So I'm gonna go ahead and kick it to Frank, who had a question as well.
Hey, Frank.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Dr. Glanville. I don't mean to take up like more of your time, but just since you're talking about the MLB, I was thinking I just wanted to hear like what your opinions were on the NBA return at the end of July, because I know some players like Kyrie Irving have spoken out about how they think it like distracts from the Black Lives Matter movement, and obviously with COVID, it's also like putting other people at risk. So I just wanted to hear your opinions on that situation.
Yeah, and thank you for the doctor title. I haven't quite. Well, I do have an honorary doctorate, so I'll just take that.
Oh,
Is it from Penn?
No, from Governor State. It's a small school in Illinois. Really incredible spot. So, but yes, it's sort of like the paper we had. I think it was assignment 3 that I added when we went into the pandemic about the world without sports.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things we kept talking about was, are we going to forget these other challenges of injustice and inequity because we're so focused on our own survival and the fact that athletes are engaging, but in ways that were safer in the sense of politically, right? They can talk about survival and helping each other and paying, coming up with fundraisers to help the not the essential workers, things like that, that were accepted in a not sticking for sports world. So now with sports returning, there is a concern that we're going to be like, oh, well, yeah, don't talk about this anymore, as if it's finite or something fungible, right? So within that, I think Kyrie Irving and others are trying to think about, I want to make sure that we still continue to have these discussions. And, and look, there's an option, Maya Moore said, hey, you know what, I'm not going to play. I'm going to put my energy into that. And these are incredible sacrifices and incredible efforts to show what, their priorities and how much they care about these issues. And so, and I know that some players are opting out and all that, but I do think that sports are going to have to show, and the media covering them are going to have to really show and demonstrate that this is deeply important to the point where it's not going to be this off switch, that we're going to continue despite the season going on and people wanting to talk about Lakers Celtics, that we maintain focus on these important issues that don't go away just because, LeBron is going to win another title or whatever. So we are recognizing that this is a watershed moment because although sports looks like they'll come back, it's still going to kind of limp along. And in that, whether it's, entertainment like Hamilton or something, our entertainment is really being rethought as to its value to society. And I think in some ways it's become a conduit to these conversations. And, maybe that will be part of the norm, and I do welcome that. I think we're going to take a while to come to some equilibrium about it. But I believe it will remain important from here on.
Thanks, Frank. That was a great question. So Doug, I know we're already a little over time. I do have one more question that I think is a great closing question, if you can.
Sure.
So, given all we've talked about tonight, I think a lot of sentiment that at least we felt is in my conversations with other fellow college students and just other people in general is, what can we actually do? Like, what we all agree, we see these problems. We're tired of just sitting back and waiting and watching them happen and hoping someone else fixes them and they go away. So what would you recommend people can do, can actually take action to kind of help create some real change as someone that has done it in the past? And I guess also, what does that change actually look like down the line as people start to take action?
All right, good. So first, I'm gonna read you a quote from an article in the New York Times from Isabel Wilkerson today, or at least I saw it today. It's about the caste system in the United States, and so this is why, because I think the first point I want to make is sometimes, we may have like-minded about certain things, but I don't take it for granted that there's dissenting opinions in different ways that people want to engage. And so one analogy I thought was very powerful was from this writer. And I want to kind of just read this back. And she was talking about the caste system and kind of parallels it to race in America. And so here's what she says on why we're invested. And I'm quoting her, so I'm going to give her credit. We in this country are like homeowners who inherited a house on a piece of land that is beautiful on the outside, but whose soil is unstable loam and rock, heaving and contracting over generations, cracks patched, but the deeper ruptures waved away for decades, centuries even. Many people may rightly say, I had nothing to do with how this all started. I have nothing to do with the sins of the past. My ancestors never attacked indigenous people, never owned slaves. And yes, not one of us was here when this house was built. Our immediate ancestors may have had nothing to do with it, but here we are, the current occupants of a property with stress cracks and bowed walls and fissures in the foundation. We are the heirs to whatever is right or wrong with it. We did not erect the uneven pillars or joist, but they are now ours to deal with. And any further deterioration is in fact on our hands. All right, so this is our house. This is our house. And it's not perfect because we're working towards a more perfect union. But all hands need to be on deck. They need to be able to work. And it doesn't have to be big things. It's little things. It's going and calling certain things out. It's challenging certain things that you see that are unfair. You think about Brenda Tracy in our class. She's like, look, it's so maybe 10% of the knuckleheads do these horrible crimes and do these things, right? But there's 90% of the people that want to do well and support this, and they think it's fair, but they're silent. They're silent. And yes, not everybody has a certain microphone, but as she also said, you don't have to have power to have influence. She talks about power in the traditional sense versus influence, and it could be the neighbor's kid across the street you're just talking to. And so we all can play a tremendous role. And part of it is to really question, to really think through. And look, one thing she goes on to talk about is when you look at a house, and it's one thing to be a homeowner, you're 10 years old and you're looking at a house. It's another if you're an inspector and you have infrared vision, you can see the cracks. Well, I think when you're in your wheelhouse, like I'm Black in the Black experience, I have a certain vision for experiences because it's related. That does not mean that, oh, well, because you can't see anything, you can't be this tremendous advocate. Because I always talk about my wife. My wife brought 4 incredible children into the world. I could never be pregnant. Doesn't mean I can't be an ally, an advocate, and still have value in that relationship, right? So there's a humility to know, okay, I may not know this or see this exactly in the same lens, but I have to have a certain faith and a trust in the source, and I have to sort of believe in this larger goal, and really go back to this core fundamentals of humanity that joins us. And we're American in this particular case. And I have family immigrants. People tell all these stories, and so it's advancing that ball, and it takes small things. As you said, my bill becoming law through all this help. It was little things, people chipping away and getting votes turned, and it wasn't tweetable that quick, and exciting. It was the slow work. You remember Martin Luther King's letter to Jackie Robinson. You need the NAACP in the courtroom, in the courthouse, doing the fighting. It's boring. It's and then you need people marching on the streets with signs to keep it under people's face about this change this is important. And so, advocacy sometimes just is as simple as seeing yourselves in each other. And although that analogy I gave is a Black experience, it doesn't mean that you don't have experiences that can be relatable. There's, your story, I don't know all your story, and I'm sure you have experiences that you felt isolated and unfairly treated. At the core of this is fairness and just being treated with respect. And we all can relate to that. We also have to know we all have bias. It's all part of being human. Some of the bias, of course, allows us to function efficiently in life. When I get in my car and I put on the windshield wipers, I know that they're going to work. I don't think about it. I do this and that's it. Now, if I had to relearn that every time I got into a car, then that would be highly frustrating, as it would learning everything else. So what do? We have bias. We assume when we hit this button in this car, this will happen. The wipers will come on, the blinkers will come on, whatever. That's bias. That's shortcuts to be efficient. But when it comes to people, it doesn't work that well. It doesn't work that well because we've been inundated with imagery and bias and racism and sexism. We've been washed over, and now we have to unlearn and relearn. And so the final point I'll make with this is Iris Bonnet, who teaches at Harvard Kennedy School about what she calls behavioral design, basically. And she's part of our class. I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, but what works. And I need to use this book more in our class. But one of the points she makes is that within facing bias in our society, we have to take off the cape and thinking we could just, I just come in and I'm going to make all the right decisions. We need to design away from our bias. We need to design, when we're looking for certain outcomes, we need to design it and build this infrastructure to protect against the favoritism and the nepotism and all the other tisms, unfortunately racism and all. We have to protect against it. If you're really looking for this outcome of saying who's the next manager of the Chicago Cubs or whatever, if that's what we truly want, we have to own that. And we have to know that we have bias and that we have to, and then I believe in that design, we will ultimately make it part of our social norm. And we will actually learn how to harness this in ways that we will be more sort of aware of our biases and employ them in different ways where we have more command over it, not through all the negativity or, so the negative elements of it. And that takes work, that takes work. So I'd say that is a patient process. It's not going to happen overnight. We're going to struggle. We're going to battle. We're going to disagree. But we have to continue to have that vision. And as my engineering professor said, we have a system as it is. And we could project it out with all kinds of analytics and numbers to where it will go if we don't change anything. But the key thing is always remembering as it should be. Where are we trying to go? What is that world? And when we identify that, then our design comes in moving for where it's going and as it will be without change to as it should be. That's the design. And I will always unequivocally come down on humanity, seeing all of us in each other, and coming down on understanding. And part of that is exposure, and part of that is the patient process of engagement constructively. And which is all goes back to my point of why I'm optimistic, even in the face of frustration. So Gage, definitely been a pleasure to join you today. 100%.
Yes. I'll leave it with that. Thank you so much, Doug, again, for giving us your time. I know you're incredibly busy. Everyone, I'd encourage to either follow Doug on Twitter or keep an eye out for all of his articles, like he said, are coming future, because they're just as good as the ones we talked about tonight, I'm sure. Doug, I hope your family stays safe. Have a great night.
All right, Gage. Thank you, everybody, for joining.
Thank you, Doug. Appreciate it.